Hello, everyone. You're catching Dr. Hawk and I actually in the middle of a conversation in which we were discussing, networks among houses of worship. We were discussing faith as it occurs in America and how it may be distinct within the U.S. And I had noted some of the trends with regard to American Christianity as it's distinct from, say, Christianity around the world. And I had asked Dr. Hawk about if there are networks among mosques or a similar, not necessarily exactly like what we see, say, with the Catholic Church, but if mosques are networked together in similar ways that, say, American Christian denominations will be networked together sometimes. And instead of just each one being an independent entity, they'll have something of a network where they coordinate in some capacity. And Dr. Hawk was talking about, was the Houston Islamic Society.
The Islamic Society of Greater Houston.
Okay, and approximately how many mosques does that include?
Well, I don't know exactly, but I believe it's around 25 or 30.
Okay, so that obviously not with an exact equivalent, but that would be somewhat similar to what sometimes in, say, a Christian tradition they refer to as a denomination. But even then, denominations are very elastic in terms of what Christian traditions mean by that. The denominations, say, of Baptist churches or Protestant churches is a very loose affiliation. The most connected that they will be is they may share funds fund missionary activities, but nothing else. There's no other polity continuities that occur across them. Whereas, say, but the opposite extreme would say be the Roman Catholic Church as a denomination, where they not only are networked across their, they are not only networked organizationally, but they even have a central global head to that organization. And everything else kind of falls in between. Like, say, I'm in an Anglican tradition organization where that doesn't have a central head, but it has enough continuity across in their organization that there may be, say, a network of Anglican churches all along the East Coast or in the South that in many cases are all networked together, and they're not necessarily independent. They do answer to higher regional structures. So it's very elastic in terms of how those organizations are networked together, or if they're attached to each other at all. From the very independent to the extremely connected and everything in between. But to help the students understand if there's any sort of comparisons we can draw, you had indicated that most mosques in America are run independently, almost like an independent business.
Well, there is in Christianity, we call it denominations, and in Islam, we call it school of jurisprudence or school of thought.
Okay.
So, like, for example, among the Sunni Islam or Sunni Muslims, there are 4 schools of fiqh or schools of jurisprudence. And then there are Shia Muslim community. So in America, there are all kinds of mosques. There are Sunni mosques, there are Shia mosques, and then within Sunni, there are more sub divisions, like there may be some kind of more fundamental kind of thoughts, thinking Muslims. There are more like liberals. There are more like they are mixed. Okay. So there are all kinds of mosques in United States, but most of these mosques, though they join each other maybe in their thoughts, but there is no organizational link.
Okay.
Like the president of the mosque or the minister or the imam of a mosque, they are all independent.
Okay.
And very few organizations are in America that have few mosques under the same organization. And what is as far as my knowledge is concerned, the biggest umbrella organization which has the maximum number of mosques under one administration is the Islamic Society of Greater Houston, which was established in 1969.
Okay.
And that time it has only 1 or 2 locations, but right now it has 30 plus locations. And these locations are huge. They are in the prime locations of the different parts of the town. And in the last 10 to 15 years, most of these centers have been built from scratch,
Right.
like with their own design and like with a mosque architect and shape. So, and some are as big as like more than 1,000 people can pray at the same time.
I see.
And most of these mosques, unlike the mosques in the Muslim world, the mosques in the United States and in European countries, they are more like just the worship places. They are like community centers.
I see.
Where you will find a multi-purpose hall, a school, a little clinic. Then there is a youth section, and there are women section. So this is like a little community center. Most of the mosques are acting like that. But yes, overall, there is no organizational or as far as the revenue or income or expenses connection with each other. But in that, every mosque is independent. Every mosque has its own 501c3, which means they are tax exempt and all those other things.
That's very similar in Christianity as well, and that is in terms of that the architectural distinction of sacred space is you're more likely to find sacred architecture outside the U.S. In say with Christianity, and then in the U.S. where houses of worship tend to be more from the architectural side, more pragmatic. And so, I mean, in many cases, if a new church is being built anymore from the outside, it's not easy to really distinguish it from any sort of other community center or convention center for that matter. So,
right.
So you wonder if, say, the American pragmatism hasn't infected a number of different faith traditions in that way. One of the things I wanted to ask about is, I mean, when we look at the expansion of Christianity throughout time, in the 16th century, European Christianity went through its own Protestant Reformation. The Roman Catholic Church, the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church had kind of reached a critical mass, and people in Central Europe responded to that by not only protesting those abuses, and that had geopolitical ramifications too. As a result, the number of different Christian denominations began to grow in Europe, but it really exploded in the US when people can do as they want. They were free to do as they wanted to do. And so the proliferation of new denominations and new flavors of Christianity within that Protestant strain really was a Western phenomenon. But in the East, say areas where the Orthodox are more prevalent, say Serbian, or well, everyone's talking about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church now, or even the Russian Orthodox Church or Greek Orthodox and so forth, it didn't have the same Reformation. There tends to be a lot more continuity there and less fracturing. I had wondered if Islam had noticed a similar trend, whereas the further west Islam goes, the greater variety in schools of thought or other aspects that you see in expressions of Islam, or is it still remaining, maintaining a good sense of continuity?
Well, definitely the passage of time and the development in everything affects everything.
Okay.
And it has affected the Islam also in many ways. So, for example, you will see that in the Muslim world, this development has affected that some scholars or some school of thoughts have appeared that they are more modern.
I see.
They are more liberal. But most of them are still like more classical. And I give you an example that in the worships or in the practices, there is not much difference, because in Islam, there is not much room of development with respect to theological and worship aspect, but with respect to the modern day thoughts. And one good example is, that Islamic worships are based on lunar calendar. Ramadan and the pilgrimage and annual charity, all you have to calculate according to the lunar months.
Is
every
Ramadan
new
going,
moon.
isn't Ramadan going on right now?
Right.
Okay,
We are in the first 10 days of Ramadan.
I see.
And today is it's the 5th of Ramadan. So for example, I was giving you an example that how we should determine the beginning of the month of Ramadan. Classically, there are traditions which say that you have to see the moon with your eyes.
Okay.
Then you will start. So somebody in the community, at least 2 people have to see the moon, and then they are reliable witnesses, so everybody can start fasting.
Okay.
But now there are new ideas that you don't need to wait for the last moment. You can check with NASA. The calculations of the new moon is going to be what day.
Right.
And if the new moon is born at certain time, then after 18 hours, that can be a visibility. So the visibility is the one which makes the month start. So now, in not only in the United States, in the European and other countries, there are 2 groups. One, they have calculated the moon rise in the next 5 years or 10 years, and they know when next year the month of Ramadan is starting.
Okay.
But then there are classical scholars, they say that no, we have to stick to the tradition that you have to see with a naked eye.
I see.
Now, this is a very hot discussion nowadays. So half of the mosques in United States are beginning their Ramadan only if they have a report when somebody have seen the moon.
I see.
And the other half, the main organization in United States is the Islamic Society of North America. They are based in Illinois. They have prepared a calendar, and in which they are trying to follow. So half of the mosques are following them, half of them are not. So month of Ramadan makes a difference of 1 or 2 days based on this kind of thing. Right. So this is an example of new things being introduced. Right. Similarly, and this takes time until everybody used to this new thing. So I believe that in next 5 years, maybe everybody will be following a calendar. But it's not that easy to leave the traditions.
I see.
And especially when traditions have got a religious value, no, Prophet said it like that, so you cannot violate it. But the other people are interpreting that Prophet said it because at that time, the only way to confirm the new moon was seeing it. Right. But now there are other ways. And similarly, there are these areas in which there is a development, but not really with respect to theology or with respect to the worships or the 5 pillars. There is not much room in Islam to have any development.
In Christianity, especially in North America, there's always this tension of maintaining its traditional beliefs, although you're updating your practices. And that's a tension that has to be, that is always navigated. That in some traditions will, stand firm on certain practices because it's believed that certain beliefs will be lost if you compromise on the practices, and because of how they're seemingly tied together. I don't know how. In Christianity, in its various different traditions, one of the controversies that has always been, hasn't always been a hot button, but it's definitely for the last, say, 40 years, is the role of sexual distinction within clergy. Are certain roles specifically prescribed for men within the Bible, within the sacred text? Specifically prescribed for men and women? Are those outdated role distinctions? To what extent can we ignore those prescriptions and prohibitions in the Bibles because we now understand more about the equality of men and women in modern society? And those are some of the debates and challenges and questions that get bantied about among theologians, wondering, well, if we change a practice, how much of our faith will we lose as a result of changing traditions? And that's a that's a big dilemma for Christianity, even particularly in North America. Other cultures not so much, but in North America, this is some of the tensions that are constantly arising. How does are similar challenges facing Islam in North America?
Well, not that much, because the role of gender, whatever majority of the Muslims in United States or in over the world, they agree that whatever comes in the Quran and whatever comes in the authentic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad with respect to worships, there is no room for any further interpretation or development. But in the other areas, like social areas or the implementation of the religion in the other areas, there is always a room for improvement.
Right.
And for example, traditionally, it has been a rule in Islam that a woman is not allowed to travel alone without somebody who is relative for more than 3 days travel.
Right.
So now there are views that since now travels are more safer and the women are not vulnerable as they used to be in those days, now flying or using others, this is so women should be allowed that they can travel by themselves.
Right.
So these kind of development are of course going on, and there are discussions going on with respect to that.
Right, and that's one of the challenges that even Christianity faces, is always trying to distinguish how much of this is cultural and how much of this is theological.
Right.
And I imagine Islam probably has to navigate the same issues, like how much should we encourage a woman to be covered, say. In one tradition, it's going to be, just what she feels is appropriate for her based upon how she wants to be adorned, and that distinction. And over the opposite extreme, of course, is areas of, say, Afghanistan or other cultures where people would like to point out where you don't see any of the women at all. And so
the ancient or traditional cultures have been like developed over the centuries with a certain Islamic practices. So for them, covering of women is not an issue. But the Muslim or the Islam, which is developing in the West, since there is a contrast that the women of other religions or other faiths are not covering. So then over here comes the question that whatever minimum requirement of covering mentioned in the Quran, many Muslim ladies try to do that. With compared to the culture, there is a lot more than that, because then besides the religion, in the different parts of the Muslim world, the culture is also playing a role. But over here, the culture is different. It's an American culture where women are not covering. Right. So many women don't cover, but others that they try to practice are practicing ladies. They try to cover, but then they will be covering like minimum that just they will be covering their head with a scarf, and the rest of the dress may be like a regular jean or a shirt. But a cultural tradition would be that a woman is in a robe or in that all kind of long cover or something like that. So of course there are cultural impacts which is affecting the Islamic lifestyle in the modern world.
And that covering, the term is a hijab?
Hijab, right.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a covering requirement for men and women differently mentioned in the Quran and in the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, particularly at the prayer time. So most of the ladies are following when they are praying, but not outside.
The idea of covering is pretty universal. I mean, there are Orthodox Jewish men that will always wear their yarmulke, and there are Christian churches, especially in the South, where women still wear their hats.
Yeah, there is some indication in the Bible also, right, for covering the women at the prayer time.
That's right. In fact, in Houston, there is a Coptic Christian church It's a Egyptian Coptic church out in Katy, actually, that I visited, where if you visit, the women sit on the right and the men sit on the left. Everyone takes their shoes off when they go inside, and if the women are visiting, if any woman that's visiting, if she doesn't have a head covering to use at the time, they will loan you one. And so it's extremely.
What is this church called?
It's out in Katy. It's I believe it's Gabriel or Michael the Archangel Orthodox Coptic Orthodox Church.
Okay, and I would like to visit that sometime.
I visited them. They were wonderful people, and I felt like I needed.
You have any contact?
What's that?
You still have any contact?
I don't have any contact there. It was a joy, because I encourage. I myself practice this, and I encourage others to also, particularly if they're in a tradition where they've just known their church or their own house of worship. Our assignment in this class was for students, if they're of a Muslim background, to visit a Christian church, and if they're Christian background, to visit a Muslim, to visit a mosque. But I encourage people, say, to visit the variety of different styles within their tradition. And so for me, I visited all sorts of different types of Christian churches because I wanted to see the wide variety of expressions of my faith. And so I visited various Orthodox churches as well. There's Greek Orthodox churches, and typically those are associated with immigrant communities because people have come from those countries and they're maintaining the continuity of the worship that they knew. And so
is this the one, St. George Coptic Orthodox Church?
The one in Katy I saw was Michael the it was two names. It was Mary and Saint Michael the Archangel. So I think, but it's a large gold dome on it, and I jokingly and lovingly say that I felt like I needed a passport to visit, because it's very different from what most often people will.
St. Mary Coptic Orthodox Church.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, it has a golden dome.
That's right. And so that's an example where someone might, if a person is even in a Christian tradition, they could visit there and see the wide variety of different expressions, because it's basically something that you would encounter from around the world. And so I encourage people to experience that level of variety and see that, the one place that maybe they've attended before isn't the complete representation of global expressions of that faith. So to that end, I'd like to transition a little bit, if I could, because when we talk about things that are, within a tradition, having to distinguish between things that are cultural versus things theological, that's within a tradition. Cross-tradition wise, in terms of Christian-Muslim relations, oftentimes when people think about Christian-Muslim relations today, my concern is that oftentimes people make assumptions about Christian-Muslim those relations globally, and assume that things are theological differences, when in reality, they may be those differences that were not necessarily theological differences, but more so differences that were a result of the 19th century. Colonialism that occurred there in ways that occurred in Muslim countries, and then how those same countries were carved up by Western powers in the early 20th century as well. And that's where I sometimes wonder about something cultural theological, because I hear this a lot, where people will say, well, Muslims this, Christians that, and they'll speak of something in its current global dynamic, when in reality, that's not a conflict or a difference that was always been the case. In many cases, they're speaking of a thing that's only a conflict that's only about 150 years old, based upon the legacy of colonialism.
You're right.
And so it seemed to me a decent transition into your remarks on European colonialism in Muslim countries, because a lot of what we see today is a product of that.
Well, what happened is that when the Muslim world was colonized, the colonizers, they were not only taking over politically, but they brought with them a lot of Christian missionaries.
Okay.
Like, for example, in Indian subcontinent, when it was colonized, there was a lot of Christian missionaries. They came. And so the local Muslims did not like the British taking over. And that was kind of political differences. They were fighting against this. But when the church and the Christianity got associated with the colonization, then of course they developed a resistance against them also. And they thought that they came to took over because they want to make everybody Christian. So that's why in the early days, having anything to do with the British, even speaking English language was considered un-Islamic or against Islam because of this thing.
Interesting.
And they developed a kind of dislike or hatred against the British. And then since church was associated with that, so it got. But then there was let me say a few things about the colonization overall.
Okay.
And what kind of impact it left. Actually, this will help us in understanding the whole thing. The colonization of the Muslim world started with the conquest of India in 1857, and it continues until the end of the Second World War, which was in 1945. And the last episode of colonization was taking Arabia from the Ottoman Empire and its distribution between France and Britain. Now, almost the entire Muslim world has been colonized. There was a time, particularly during the Second World War. And for example, much of the Africa, Asia, and Arab world was colonized by British and France. These were the two major colonizing powers. Indonesia was taken over by Dutch colonizers. And East Africa, Philippines, and Malay was taken over by German, Spanish, Portugal, and Russian forces. While the current state of West Bank and Gaza is still considered like a colonization by the Israel. But less than 100 years colonization changed forever a lot of things in the Muslim world, including geography, economy, social relations, politics. This was changed forever in the Muslim world, which was different. Now, when the Muslim world was colonized, there immediately movements and efforts started to get liberation. And after the World War II, the Muslim states started to becoming liberated. And especially after 1947, it started taking place. The liberation of the Muslim state was either a result of negotiated withdrawal of the colonial powers, like what happened in India, in Middle East or Far East. And sometimes it was a result of a brutal wars of independence, like in Algeria and Libya and some other African countries.
I have a
Now,
map. I have a map for what you're talking about. If it might be helpful for the students to see this while you're talking. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes, thank you. Now, this is important to understand that unlike in other colonized world, the Muslim world resisted mainly because of Islam. And Muslim scholars and thinkers, they started Islamic movements to work against the colonizing powers, either by negotiating with them or preparing to fight against them. So in different parts of the world, different movements and different Islamic scholars are known with their efforts to liberate that part of the Muslim world. For example, if you look at the Indian subcontinent, you will see that Sayyid Ahmad Shaheed is one of the big names. Muhammad Iqbal, Abul Kalam Azad, who became the first president of the India after the independence, and Maulana Maududi and Jamiat Ulama Hind. These were some of the organizations that really resisted and prepared Muslims to stand up against the colonization powers in the Indian subcontinent. And with respect to Iran, you will see that Mirza Hassan Shirazi and Jamaluddin Afghani, these are the well-known names that are known as fighting against the colonization. In Central Asia, where the Russians took over the Muslim countries, the Imam Shamil's movement is very popular. In Africa, there has been a lot of movements against the colonization. In Algeria, there was a name, Amir Abdul Qadir. In Sudan, it was Mahdi Sudani. Osman Don Fodio was in West Africa, Omar Mukhtar in Libya, and Ikhwan Hassan al-Banna and others in Egypt. These were the well-known scholars in the Muslim world that resisted. These movements continued their struggle even after the liberation, and because many Muslim countries were left by the colonization in the hands of secular powers, secular people. So the Islamic movements that started during the colonization period continued working even after the colonization, after the decolonization, because the government was mostly inclined towards secular system. And so that's where the colonization, one of the colonization impact that we can see. Now, if you look currently at the post-colonial Muslim world, I just give you a little idea. There are about 50 plus Muslim states. Even after the political and military withdrawal of the colonial powers kept their economic interest protected in the Muslim countries. Legacy of the colonization continued shaping economy, politics, and societies of the Muslim countries. Colonization continued to stay in the state of ideologies, political visions, government institutions in the Muslim countries. Post-colonial Muslim world is divided into nations and states, which was not the case in the pre-colonization Muslim world. Although Islam and Islamic movements kept a sense of unity alive in the Muslim countries, but practically it could not go beyond a formal organization of Muslim Islamic countries. The division of the Muslim world into territorial states and nationalism is one of the direct impact of the colonization that the world is going through. Muslim world has accepted this new division and boundaries on the basis of this nation's division that has been made after the colonization. Even worldwide Islamic movements got divided on the basis of these. Now, one of the biggest impact on the Muslim world of the European colonization was that the Muslim countries have been divided into countries that never existed before colonization period. So the Muslim world, you can say, has been divided into 50 parts. Well, it was not like that. It was mainly 2, 3, or 4 dynasties that all over the Muslim world they were ruling. But now Muslim world is divided into 50 plus parts. This division, why it was done by the colonialists? Was it done in order to favor the masses or the Muslims living in the Muslim world? No, it was not, unfortunately. The division was not based on the interest of these nations or the people, but it was, unfortunately, for the interest of the colonialists. For example, some divisions were to accommodate local colonial officials. Some divisions were to resolve diplomatic tensions between the colonial powers. Post-World War plan to distribute Ottoman Arab territory was basically to appease France, Italy, and Greece. British interest in Persian Gulf oil led to the creation of Kuwait, for example. For the same economic interest, British did not let Brunei join Malaysia, otherwise they both have been together culturally and geographically. France created Lebanon out of Syria to create a Christian Arab state. British created Jordan to accommodate Amir Abdullah, who fought on the British side in the World War against Ottomans. So this is how colonialists left the Muslim world not only into divided, but the trained legacy kept the so-called Islamic State on the same lines, like nationalism, secularization, ethnic identities. That's why you see in many Muslim world, there are resistant movements against the government, right? Because the government is more inclined towards secular kind of system, while the people are trying, or the Islamic movements are trying to do it, right, in the Islamic. Now, what is the impact? Colonialists created elite ruler class, trained in their own language and loyal to their nations and not to Islam. The division developed their own culture, boundaries, and nationalities, which never let them united as they were before the colonization period. These Muslim states developed mutual rivalries. Many Muslim countries have border tensions. They started fighting, like Iraq and Iran, and many other countries like that. These tensions resulted into wars and long-term disunity. Ethnic rivalries within the states, and particularly illiteracy, corruption, dictatorship, political instability, you will see in most of the third world or in many of the Muslim countries. These are the direct impact of the colonization. And then currently you can see that there is a process started, which we call it brain drain, that many Muslims, that they were intelligent, they were genius, they were developing, and they didn't find in their own countries, in their own setup, a good opportunity. So they were attracted towards the West. So they went there, and where they got opportunities and they felt. Now, with respect to the Christian-Muslim relations, this has both negative and positive impacts. The negative impact was because the Muslims thought that our freedom was taken over by the European colonialists, and the Christianity was related with them. So they didn't look at the Christianity with a very friendly manner. But on the other hand, in many Muslim parts of the world where Christians were not living, after the colonization, they see that some people, for example, a lot of conversion from different religions, mostly from Hindu religions, into Christianity in the Indian subcontinent. And now there is a Christian community living next to the Muslim community. So they got this opportunity to know each other. And Pakistan, for example, which was in 1947, India was divided into two countries, Pakistan and India. And then in 1971, Pakistan got further divided into East Pakistan and West Pakistan. You will see in the West, in Pakistan today, a huge Christian community. Half of them are Protestants, half of them are Catholics. But if you go there, you will see that their culture is not much different than the Muslims. The women cover the same way as the Muslim women cover. The men are using the same dress like the Muslim men are using. And sometimes they use the same terminology for their worships. For example, the prayer in Pakistan, Urdu language is called namaz. So many Christians are using the same word for their services. And the church setup and the church organization and all that, this is good. So this is how the colonization of the Muslim world had, and now and during that, what happened, and these are some of the impacts that it had.
Interestingly, for the students, they have an extra credit opportunity that they can still take advantage of. And I wanted to point out that several of these have to do directly with the material that you're discussing. Lawrence of Arabia, that was filmed made in 1962, has to do with that, post that World War I and post World War I carving up of the Muslim territories by European powers, and the tensions that arise from having to impose upon people borders and that are and protectorates that are really serving the Allied powers in that regard, whereas without as much regard for the benefit that it might have for the Muslim community there. Another one.
The Lawrence of Arabia is a very interesting one, and it is based mainly focused on how the Middle Eastern Arab tribes were convinced to support France and British in the Second World War.
There's that, and also there's one other film that, well, there's another film on the list of movies that the students could review called The Mission, and it was
The Mission.
The Mission, a 1986 movie, The Mission, and it's a film that is depicting Roman Catholic missionaries going into Brazil or into South America to evangelize and to expand and to set up Christian missions there. But the challenge is that they are very much, they enjoy the benefits of colonialism, because colonialism is expanding territories into which they can construct new missions. But then the ethical dilemma occurs for them when they're able to establish missions in the jungles of South America. But then when the Portuguese and the Spanish are wanting to enslave those very people that are being Christianized, then these missionaries are now find that they can't extricate themselves from the colonial practices that put them there in the first place. And so as a result, there's that tension of is this Christian missionary activity or is this colonial expansion? And how do if you want to make those things distinct, it's not so easy to extract one from the other once you've entered a new territory. For that very reason, there is one other film that I oftentimes point out to students that are trying to appreciate why it is that many areas of the world will see Christian missionary activity as colonial. It was made more recently. It was a movie that came out just a few years ago by Martin Scorsese called Silence. And Silence. And I'll share my screen just briefly. Here. This is Silence. Called Silence. And the let me see if I can. This film that was created as what it is the premise of it is two Roman Catholic priests have been sent to Japan to investigate why a previous priest, Roman Catholic priest who had gone to Japan had renounced his faith. And they were there to investigate why that person had apostatized and left the faith. Well, what they find there is when they go there is the Japanese feudal rulers of feudal Japan are intensely persecuting anyone who converts to Christianity, and specifically anyone who comes there bringing Christianity. And as the story unfolds, you're tempted to think, oh, these Japanese are simply against Christianity. Not so. What they find in the course of the priest's dialogue with the local Japanese feudal overlord is that he says, your faith and your colonial instincts are so tied together that we are trying to preserve our culture. If you try to bring your faith here, we will lose our culture. We will become a colony of the West. And the missionary says, oh, not so. We're just trying to expand our faith. And the Japanese ruler says, you are so naive. You're extremely naive. Everywhere your faith goes, you generate new colonies of Western powers, and we are not going to become one of those. And so that's something that students might find challenging to view, but it does. It is a decent. It's based upon a novel that was created that is historically faithfully shows the conditions of the time. But it's a novel nonetheless that Martin Scorsese wanted to bring to screen because it shows how these naive missionaries think that they're just expanding their faith, but in reality, the Japanese understand that you're actually bringing by means of your faith, there are some that will try to colonize us, and we simply can't have that. And it's called silence because the missionaries are struggling with this idea, and when they try to pray about it, they hope that God will give them some guidance as to what to do, but God is silent and will talk and seemingly won't give them any guidance. They simply have to go on conscience. And so hopefully students will find that challenging. And if some decide that they want to look at that may be a way to they can wrap their mind around this idea that colonialism and faith expansions of faith very difficult to extract or extricate one from the other, especially in light of what's taking place in history.
Right.
So when now when people are just talking about Christian-Muslim relations now, it's oftentimes more so, it's not so much a legacy of the differences between Islam and Christianity, so much as it is a legacy of colonial powers that basically impose their will on Middle Eastern countries. And the response of many is that they simply don't want to be the plaything of Western powers anymore. I mean, I don't know that anyone, particularly in American politics, anyone who seeks to be president, the first thing someone's going to ask them is, what are you going to do about Middle East peace? As though it's
right.
their job to do something about Middle East peace.
Right.
So for the students, I've placed within the content section of our page. I'll go ahead and share my screen again really quickly. I placed within, let's see here. I placed in the content section of the page a PDF of some of what you were talking about. That has the map that what you're referring to, the various different countries and their different European controlled territories, and their that when they finally achieved independence from being a colony of a European power. They had like for example, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia had previously been under independent European control, and they were able to achieve that. But these are, in some cases, a rather late date when they're finally achieved their independence from European control. United Kingdom was exerting control over many countries until finally they were able to assert their independence at seemingly at a later date. So students can go through and review this map. I included maps of some of the early first maps, like for example, during the early colonialism period, like the very late 17th century into the 18th century, the Treaty of Karlowitz marks the end of Austro-Ottoman War, and a slow collapse of the Ottoman Empire begins. And into this vacuum moved European commercial interests with modest military presence to protect them, like the East Indian Trading Company. But that was that foothold as the Ottoman Empire began to contract, and still a presence that later would even be part of the Central Powers, but still though losing its ability to kind of keep European commercial interests out of their area. But then as colonialism expanded over the 19th century, many of the European powers were starting to make colonies of everywhere. And that's, that unfortunately unchecked, that can develop a mentality of kind of like this Anglo-centric perspective of the world, like, the world as the world as a chessboard that, European powers are, need to, can do with as they wish. And then, as this handout, students can review that, during this kind of a colonial period of colonialism, and you specifically were addressing much of this, developing in much of the 19th century, European military presence escalates with Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, and the French continue to control much of North Africa and Syria. You had talked about that as well. We wanted to, at some point, get your take on the Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1916. And it names France the protector of Arab Syria and Kurdish Mosul province, and names Great Britain as the protector of Baghdad and Basra province. And that Sykes-Picot Treaty winds up becoming much of what it seems to be, from my reading, and particularly from Carabel and Goddard, seems to be much of the challenges we face in terms of people didn't like their territory carved up the way it was. Much of that can be tied to the Sykes-Picot Treaty, it seems. I mean, when we look at borders going across the Arabian Peninsula, many of those borders appear to have been achieved by someone just taking a protractor and drawing a line on a map, not associated with any sort of natural barriers between tribes or peoples of different ethnic groups or philosophical differences. It just, someone decided to lay a map out across a drawing table in a smoke-filled room in the UK and to start drawing lines. So, and that kind of leads us to how areas being aligned, carved up with areas of occupation, French occupation, British occupation, even Russian occupation have been the eastern, what would be Eastern Turkey, French and British protectorates, and then resulting in much of the Middle East being carved up into this kind of this era of Egypt, where Egypt finally is able to gain limited independence from Britain, and the Republic of Turkey is formed in 1923. But it's not until after World War II that many of Middle Eastern nations gain independence, like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or Iraq and Egypt, and even like Cyprus in 1960. But in 1948, establishment of the Jewish state by United Nations, the establishment of the Jewish state in 1948 winds up being something of a particularly interesting, I guess for lack of a better term, football, because there's, please correct me if I'm a little off on this, but it seems as though the existence of the Jewish state to many in the Middle East, not so much anything anti-Semitic, so much as it is that the Jewish state is symptomatic of when your territory is carved up by European powers, it seems. So you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong about that, but it doesn't seem as though the resistance that Israel has by its neighbors has so much to do with any sort of anti-Semitic sentiment.
Yeah, I call it
like this country is.
It's more like a property dispute than a religious dispute.
Right. It seems so.
And that when property disputes are there, then it doesn't matter who is that. It may be your own brother.
Right.
But this happened to be Jewish and Muslims on different sides of the property dispute. So that's what it is. And I don't think it should be taken as religious dispute.
Right. Well, and especially when that property is so pregnant with sacred stories. There's so much sacred space that's there that it's still going to be a challenge of it. Well, it's going to be a very significant landscape. But for many, I imagine that for many, it probably seems like it's still evidence that some European powers.
I mean, the Jerusalem has been under in the last 1400 years,
right,
except 100 when after the first Crusades, when it was taken over for 100 years until the Salahuddin Ayyubi took it again. It has been under the Muslim administration, and from all over the world, Christians, Jews have always been visiting. And
Mhm.
there has not been as hard as it is today for a Muslim living in Jordan or in the other areas to go to the Holy Mosque in Jerusalem. They have to go through so much search and stripping and everything. And even if I want to go visit over there, there are a lot of procedures. So that's where the problems are.
I see. Okay. And I wanted to get your thoughts about that, just because for many people it's a messy topic because we don't for some that don't know the history there.
Right.
I'll go ahead and stop at this point. For many that don't know the history and about how it was carved up by European powers and many country boundaries established rather arbitrarily. But also it's a messy topic, and this can be a subsequent conversation.
The real problem is misunderstanding came because the decision to make the state of Israel was first approved in the British Parliament.
Okay.
By what was his name, Barclay, or this declaration.
Okay.
So, and that was a colonial move. And anything related with the colonialism, it does not have a good impression with respect to those areas that has been colonized. So Israel is taken as one of the remains of the colonization.
Well, and we don't have necessarily sufficient time now, but I think that it would be profitable to talk a little bit about this next time. And that is that in American politics, it's made even messier by the fact that much of American Christianity will ascribes theological significance to the state of Israel in how they interpret the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result, because American politicians are so much beholden to their constituents, and as is appropriate, but nevertheless, many of those constituents have as their legacy the American version of Christianity that reads the Bible a certain way. And particularly as it relates to the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, Christianity is not all of one mind about how that is to be interpreted. It's a lot of apocalyptic literature in that book of Revelation. But the history of Christianity is that there are different ways to read that book, that portion of the Bible that's rather apocalyptic. And the Catholic traditions, Orthodox, Anglican, Roman, they tend to read the book of Revelation one way, but many American Protestants read the book of Revelation an entirely different way that places the nation of Israel in some sort of theological or apocalyptic significance. And so as a result, politicians are then beholden to those constituents and are under pressure to place the nation of Israel with prominent give it priority because of that dynamic of how people think that the Bible somehow has anything to say about the political entity that was created in 1948 called Israel. And that makes it even more messy, and we can go into that next time. But the point is, I guess
maybe next time you can explain more the biblical interpretation which is connected with the state of Israel.
I'd be happy to. I guess I'm admittedly teasing it a little bit for next time, but
Okay.
But especially when we talk about kind of the development of the modern Muslim countries, I'm sure that you're able to share more with us about that than we've gotten into.
Because from the Muslim perspective, it is only looked at as a political issue, the way America is supporting Israel, because of they think it is only political, but
Right.
it's not that. It inside is a religious factor.
And there really is.
Right.
So no, I think it'll be profitable to get into that in the future, because I think that for many it can be a real mystery. Why do American politicians focus on this so much? And in many cases, because there's political pressure from their constituents.
And probably Israel is also, it is in its interest to get that
absolutely.
support to face its surrounding environment.
Absolutely. No, they benefit very much from that. But unfortunately, I mean, in many cases, politically, people will make theological assertions about Israel that, and we'll get into that next time. But it's really has to do with a specific interpretation of the Bible.
Right.
That's not even.
That will be
really
very
not
interesting.
universal.
I hope that will be interesting for the students too.
I look forward to it. So, just as a reminder to the students that we have a month remaining in the semester. Hopefully, the final projects are coming along very well. The short essays have been very good, and we've seen good participation there. So, thank you very much, Dr. Hawk. I'll go ahead and stop our recording now, and we'll talk a little bit more afterwards.